guest who is invited somewhere and starts off by asking a favor. But can I ask you a favor? Can I take this jacket off?
Yes, sir.
Because I'm liable to get a little worked up. I have given speeches all over America to audiences as small as 10 or 20 and as large as 1,500. And I have never been more scared because I am humbled to be asked to come here today to speak on this occasion. And as I met several of the family members, I told them, I don't even know what to say to you. Because I remember how this event impacted me 2 years ago on this day. I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and for most of my adult life I've lived in Seattle, Washington. And yet when this event happened, it felt like I was stabbed in the heart. And I have thought a lot about what I should say this morning and how I should say it. And I have fretted over this talk more than any talk I've given in the last 15 years. And what I think I came on last night came from the meaning of the word memorial. Because memorial, especially a memorial for these 9 souls that were lost and for the survivors that are here, and especially a memorial, not just for any church, but for Mother Emanuel AME Church in this county, on this occasion. One of the things that became clear to me is that if I do nothing else, I better tell the truth. The positive impact that the 9 people we lost had on this community is demonstrated by the family, friends, and community members that are here in this tent 2 years later to keep their memory alive. But the reason they were taken from us, the reason that they lost their lives, still festers because we have such a hard time in America telling the truth about race. James Baldwin said this: one of the things that has always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is this aversion to history. History is not something you read in a book. History is not even the past. It's the present. Because the past defines how we got to where we are today. And without understanding and recognizing the truth about the past, how can we ever expect to actually move forward unless we're telling the truth? So I'm going to spend some time today to tell the truth. Because folks, our history, and when I say our history, I was listening to a tape of, folks heard the name Brian Stevenson before? An absolute hero in American justice. And I was listening to Brian talk about the history of, and yes, I'm going to use the S word, slavery. And one of the things he said is, this is not Black history in America. This is American history. Because no one under this tent, no one listening to my voice has ever owned a slave. Slavery is not our fault. It is not our responsibility. But it is our shared history. It is part of American history. And what I am here to tell you is that our history is being challenged. Our history, in the minds of some, is meant to be manipulated and changed. In March of this year, 2017, a cabinet member of our government, an African American, Ben Carson, said this about slavery. There were other immigrants who came here in the bottom of slave ships with a dream of prosperity. Now, the people that were on those ships, I don't think they had dreams. Nightmares I'm willing to buy. But they weren't having dreams of prosperity. What they were having were nightmares of what has happened to me. Who has ripped me from my home and brought me to a land I've never even seen before? I can't even understand the words they are saying. And when you characterize slavery as part of the immigration process in America, here is my point. Children are listening. This is the government. This is our government. And children are in schools, and they are hearing these things, and their understanding of the truth is being warped. And all of us will pay for that if we let our history be taken away from us. 1 month early, in February of 2017, Betty DeVos, the Secretary of Education, said this about historical black universities and colleges. They are living proof that when more options are provided to students, they are afforded greater access and greater quality. And of course, we know that those colleges and universities existed because we couldn't go to school with white people. They wouldn't let us into those schools. And for her to characterize these universities and the critical role they have played in educating black people in America that way is a lie. And it is not a lie that has no meaning, because our history is within that lie. And to the extent that people are growing up thinking that these colleges and universities serve one purpose, they completely misunderstand how we got to 2015, where a young man walks into a church with his heart filled with so much racial hatred that we're here 2 years later. The truth cannot be forgotten. In Texas, today, in public schools, children are being taught that slavery was a side issue in the Civil War. And one thing I want to talk about, even in Charleston, is the Confederate flag. In June of last year, CNN did a national poll of people under 40 years old. 33% said that the flag was a symbol of racism. 57% said the flag was a symbol of Southern pride. What I would suggest to you as you think about these issues, because what I want you to remember is that Dylan Roof has been photographed holding a Confederate flag with Confederate flag emblems on his car. And so is this just something about Southern culture, or is it something else? And as opposed to asking ourselves or thinking ourselves about what it might mean, I have a radical idea. What if you went back to the secession statements of each state and asked them what it meant? Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. How could they say that? Here's how. Because in 1860, 13% of the United States population was enslaved. Think about that for a minute. 13%. The value of slaves in 1860 exceeded the value of every bank, factory, and railroad in America combined. A total of $3 billion in 1860 money. I will tell you one of the revolutions that has occurred in my head, because I went to Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I then went to Harvard Law School. I have had some of the best education that anybody in America has been fortunate enough to get. And most or many of the facts that I have learned going around the country, talking about our history of race in America, I didn't know. Because nobody taught me. I go around the country to the most educated people in America, and they have never heard of the St. Louis Massacre in 1917, when 250 black people were killed, with their houses being set on fire, and white folks standing outside and shooting as they ran from their homes. They have never heard of the massacre in 1919 in Arkansas. My parents were born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1926, and when I was growing up as a kid, and sometimes their friends would come by the house and they would get to talking about things, I always remembered hearing them talk about the thing that happened in Arkansas. It was the thing that happened in Arkansas. And it wasn't until I was older that they finally talked to me about it. And I said, Mommy, Daddy, why didn't you tell us this thing that was like in my head? And I didn't know what it was. And of course, you know what they said. They were spirits. Because the truth sometimes is a scary thing. When the shooting happened in Orlando just recently, and 50 people were killed in that nightclub, my heart just broke. And I felt like, my God, that is one of the most terrible, senseless acts you can ever imagine. And as the news media started talking about it, go back and look at the original clips, not the ones they talk about today. Because when they talk about it today, they say it's the greatest mass shooting by one person in U.S. history. But when they talked about it when it happened, it was the greatest mass shooting of any number of people at one time in U.S. history. And that's because people didn't know our history and don't even start talking about the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. And so there may be many people in this audience that know about those things, but let me tell you, the rest of America doesn't. And if you don't understand that terrorism is something that black communities have been dealing with for years before the World Trade Center, and you don't understand our history. Let me get back to the states, because this is South Carolina. And what South Carolina had to say was this: the election of Lincoln is the election of a man to a high office of president of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. And that's why South Carolina left. Louisiana. The people of the slave-owning states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. What I want you to realize is slavery made America rich. It made America one of the richest countries in the world. And while it is not our fault, it is absolutely not our fault. Folks, I'm just telling you, the money didn't just go away and kind of up into the atmosphere. It went into companies who hired families, who bought homes, who built things for their children so they can pass them on to the next generation, so they can participate in what in reality we all want, which is the American dream that if I work hard and if I apply myself, my kids are going to have it better than I did, and their kids are going to have it better than they did. That is the American dream. This is the last one I'm going to read to you, because it's my favorite, from Texas. And here's one of the things about these statements. There was a time in America when people were not afraid to talk about white supremacy, because it wasn't an embarrassment. It wasn't something that you had to hide. It was something that you could say out loud. This is Texas. All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, as existing in the states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free. And wait for it. And is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. Is that the most reliable source we could have? As a people, this is William T. Thompson, the creator of the flag. As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. He couldn't say it any more clearly. So let me ask you this. How many people in this room, can we see a show of hands, know who the colonial Marines were? I see 2 hands in this room. Once again, we are in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most historical black places in America. We have people of all kinds of education and intelligence here. I am not trying to lord something over you saying, I know something and you don't, because I didn't know this stuff either. And I am humiliated that I could graduate from Harvard Law School and not know my history. The Colonial Marines were a group of black soldiers that fought for the British. And you know why they fought for the British? Because the British said, if we win, we'll give you your freedom. And as you might imagine, when men and women are fighting for their freedom, they can be vicious. So how many people in this room have heard the 3rd stanza of the national anthem? And we have a few more hands, but not everybody. About 3 months before Francis Scott Key saw the bombs bursting over the flag and was so empowered that he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, he was in a fight with the Colonial Marines. And there is a technical military term, please excuse me, they got a butt whipping. And Francis Scott Key was scared. And one of the things that he wrote is, this is dangerous. Because if all these slaves band together and start to fight, we've got a problem. Here is the 3rd stanza, or the end of the 3rd stanza of the national anthem. And no refuge could save the hireling or slave from the terror of flight or the good of the brave. In the Star-Spangled Banner, in triumph of God, for the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is our national anthem. A verse that we are not taught, because if we were taught that, we would start to realize that white supremacy was always one of the founding ideas of this country. It is not our fault, folks, but that's what it was. 40 of the 56 people who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. And when we're talking about taking our history away, George Orwell wrote a book called 1984, a really terrifying book. And this is one of the things he said about history. Who controls the past controls the future. And who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the present has the ability to set the agenda for what we think about the past. And if we take in that knowledge, false, about what our past was, it will impact what we try and do as we go forward. This is what our president has said about Andrew Jackson. Had Jackson been a little later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart, and he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said there's no reason for this. This is the President of the United States who is saying these words, and there are just a couple problems with it. First of all, he died in 1845, 16 years before the Civil War started. So that's a problem. He presided over the passing of the Indian Removal Act, which took thousands of Native Americans off land in the Southeast and sent them into the West and the Midwest. And you know why that happened, right? Because they needed the land to plant cotton. Cotton made up 60% of United States exports in 1860. The richest place in America in 1860, the Mississippi Valley, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, one of the poorest places in America today, economically. And the other thing about Andrew Jackson is, to be polite, he was a homicidal maniac. He owned, and his family owned, over 300 people during his lifetime. His entire estate was built on money from slavery. He regularly whipped and beat the slaves that he owned. And if you want something interesting, here is a newspaper article from 1837 where Andrew Jackson is sending out or putting an ad in the newspaper because he wants his runaway slave back. And here's what he says: $50 reward, and I'll pay all expenses if you catch him. All refundable expenses are paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300.
Well, that's some sick food.
I don't care if he was president of the United States. You don't see other countries who have leaders with that kind of legacy honoring those leaders. And certainly not telling our children that this was a man who somehow had it in his big heart that slavery was a bad thing. It's not the truth, and it leads people to believe things that are not true. What George Orwell was saying is that you control the present, so you control the past, and you control the past, and you control the future, and you set the course for the future. Because a narrative about our true racial history has never been engaged in America. I have been a criminal defense lawyer for 34 years. And when I represent someone who goes into court and they're going to be sentenced for a crime, the very first thing the judge wants to know is, have you accepted responsibility for your actions? Are you accountable for what you have done, so you can realize what you've done and then move forward and regain the trust and confidence of the community? Well, a narrative that America has basically solved all of its problems with race, that diminishes the legacy of racism. And it makes Dylan Roof a symptom, just an individual who can be dealt with, instead of a symptom of a much larger problem in America. And so let me say this, with the respect and all the respect and love I can give to the families, especially for the way you have conducted yourselves, with all of America watching during the criminal proceedings that you have to endure. Because I have never seen your love, your class, and your courage in the way these families conducted themselves. Doing something that is unthinkable. Please stand up and go down. What I want to say is this: it's the last time that Dylan Roof's name will be in my mouth.
Amen.
Executing Dylan Roof will not show that Charleston doesn't have a race problem. It's bigger than that. A 20-something-year-old man goes into a place of hallowed ground with so much hate in his heart that he does the unthinkable. Let me tell you what the execution of Dylan Roof will do. It will normalize what happened in Arkansas just a few months ago, when the governor tried to execute 8 men in 10 days, and every one of them was black. Because when it comes to the death penalty in America, it's black and brown bodies that get strapped to the gurney awaiting the needle. The death penalty is lynching's child. And it is us, black Americans, who suffer most from the injustice of the death penalty. This is not about what Dylan Roof deserves. This is about who we are. This is about what we value. And if love will conquer hate, then let him sit in a jail cell and think about what he has done for the rest of his life.
That's right. Ain't nothing wrong with general population.
There are so many different things that I have wanted to say, and I don't want to take up too much time. But yesterday, as I was sitting with the South Carolina chapter of the ACLU, one of our strongest chapters, the people who are doing the work at that chapter are doing heroic work in this state. Let me tell you, you will hear from us as the weeks go on in terms of what's happening in South Carolina in criminal justice. And it is not to single out South Carolina, because this is a problem all over America. Part of what I am here to tell you with all of my heart is that the ACLU national office and the South Carolina chapter, we will stand with you as you push forward for racial justice in this community, in this state, and in America. We are not going anywhere. That I promise you. So I'm about to end. As I was sitting in the office yesterday in the ACLU chapter here in South Carolina, I got news over the cell phone that the officer who shot and killed Orlando Castillo in Minnesota was acquitted in his trial. And that came on the heels of the officer in Oklahoma who shot the man that was standing with his hands up by the side of his car. And what that tells me is that justice under the law, because those verdicts were justice under the law. None of us were in that courtroom. None of us heard what the juries heard. None of us were given the legal instructions that the jury was given. And so I am willing to believe that the jurors did the best they could to provide a verdict that equals justice under the law. But justice under the law does not always mean that the law provides justice. And if it is virtually impossible to convict a police officer of killing unarmed black people, then the law needs to be changed. And so, I was so depressed yesterday when I heard this news from Minnesota. And there are times when I have felt like my job at the ACLU, I've been there 2 years, and I think my job is essentially traveling around the country and trying to make people really uncomfortable with race in America. And so you don't always get a very warm reception when this is the message you're trying to give. But what I believe is that when people are uncomfortable, when you get people at the point of cognitive dissonance, where there are things in the head that are conflicting, that's where somebody will make a change. That's where somebody will be willing to do something different than they've done before. Because deviation from the norm is an absolute necessity to make progress. If you don't deviate from the norm, you are going to get exactly what we have gotten up to this point. And so I think when my frustration is peaking and I feel like banging my head against the wall and I feel tired, and I'm just going to share with you some things that have helped me. One is the Montgomery bus boycott. And everybody thinks that Martin Luther King was one of the heroes of that bus boycott. Can I tell you the truth? He had very little to do with it. He got appointed as the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and do you know why? Because the older ministers in town said, somebody's going to jail behind this, and let's let it be the young guy, because we're going to want to go to jail. The heroes of the bus boycott were the women.
Amen. Yeah, baby. Y'all better cheer a little louder.
And instead of starting their days at 6:30 or 7 in the morning, they started them at 3:30 or 4 in the morning so they could get there without riding that bus. And then they walked back home and got there at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and then took care of their families, and then got up the next day and did it all over again. And I get pissed if I'm 15 minutes late for work because there's traffic. What do I say to them when I get frustrated and tired? Who told us that this was going to be easy? Who told us that this was going to be a walk in the park? Who told us that there wouldn't be bloodshed and lives lost in a pursuit of freedom? Nobody told us that, and our history tells us different. Our history tells us that that's the price that is paid for true freedom. These women, most of them who didn't even have an 8th grade education, ended segregation in public travel in America. And they had no idea they were going to do that. But they did it anyway. The students who sat at these lunch counters in the South, they had no idea that they were going to end segregation in public accommodations. But they did it. They did it anyway. So if you're going to talk honestly about our legacy of race in America, just get comfortable with the fact that it's going to be uncomfortable. Because civility is important. Love is critical. But without truth, neither of them can succeed. And so, the second memorial for people who lost their lives and survived an incredible act of hate. And in a way, this is more about us than about the people who are gone. Because the 9 people who lost their lives, they've done what they were going to do.
Amen.
They've touched the lives in this community that they have touched. They made the sacrifices to make Charleston a better place. And their legacy is set in stone.
Yes, sir.
Nobody can take that away from them. The question is not about them. The question is about us. So what are we gonna do? Because the second part of their legacy is not in their hands. It's in our hands. And the question is, what are we gonna do with that legacy? Because if we are ready to act with the courage and the commitment that they showed in their lives, you're talking about changing Charleston, South Carolina, and the United States of America. Thank you.
Woo! About to get fun. Let's go to church.
Let's go ahead and give Jeffrey Roberts another hand.
Yes, sir.